Hello and welcome to all to this webinar on unfolding the concept of prolonged collective trauma, the case of Palestine, which is hosted by APA Division 52, International Psychology. And this webinar is part of an ongoing series to celebrate activities of psychologists around the world, to provide useful information for international engagement, and to encourage us to take a broad and global perspective. My name is PIna Marsico, and I, along with Luca Tateo, are your co-host, while Rosa Traversa, who promoted to today's webinar, will be the moderator. We want to thank the other members of the webinar committee, Dr. Falu Rami, Dr. Karen Brown, Mary Bullock, and Daniel Balva. And before we begin, our online audience have the ability to ask a question by typing them in the chat box located at the bottom left of your screen. So please feel free to type your question during the conversation, during the presentation, and Rosella will be making note on them and organizing them. And at the end of the presentation, she will present them to our speakers. So at this time, I introduce and welcome our guest speakers, Dr. Samah Jabr. She is a psychiatrist practicing in the public and private sector within Palestine in East Jerusalem and West Bank. She is currently the head of the mental health unit within the Palestinian Ministry of Health. She has taught both in the classroom and a clinical setting on the faculties of several Palestinian universities, and she is affiliated with the George Washington University within the Division of Global Mental Health, where she is currently an associate clinical professor of psychiatric and behavioral sciences. Dr. Sabrina Russo is a member of the Italian Board of Psychology and Psychotherapy. She's graduated from Firenze University in Italy with a degree in Psychology and Specialization in Gestalt Psychotherapy, accredited by the Italian Ministry of Education. In Palestine for 15 years, she has been collaborating with several local international associations and the university. So thank you very much, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful for this opportunity, and thanks for the generous introduction. Give me 1 minute to share my slides. All right. So thanks to Sabrina for choosing this interesting title for our talk today. It's Unfolding the Concept of Prolonged Collective Trauma, the Case of Palestine. Trauma is a controversial topic. Trauma theorists agree that, with the exception of dissociative identity disorder, no other diagnostic condition in the history of the DSM has created more controversy about boundaries of the condition, symptomatological profile, and central assumptions, and the clinical utility and prevalence than PTSD. The changing definition has clinical, forensic, and research implication. So let me start by talking about this and how the trauma is conceptualized internationally. Then I will focus on Palestine. So it started by we started knowing something about trauma through war syndromes, which are mainly characterized by unexplained medical symptoms with different names: hysteria, then the Costa syndrome, the soldier's heart, then the shell shock, then effort syndrome, effects of Agent Orange, and then PTSD was introduced in 1980 to the DSM-3. And after that came the Gulf War syndrome, and enduring personality changes were described also by the ICD-10 with the term DESNOS, disorder of extreme stress, not otherwise specified. Traumatic events as a foundation of the diagnosis. The traumatic event is also debatable and has changed in definition over time. So in the DSM-3, it was referred to as an event existing outside the range of usual human experience. Then there were more precision of the description of trauma in the DSM-4, and in the DSM-5, We see an update to the definition, which makes reference to the sexual violence. And there was also a change in the definition of the sudden and violent death. All of these changes, I will not go over them, but all of these changes to the definition of the trauma makes us understand the controversy about PTSD. International trauma figures, and which comes from research that was made mainly in Anglo-Saxon countries, tells us the following. 70% of adults, for example, in the US, have experienced some type of a traumatic event. And we heard that traumatic event can be very variant, very different, and the definition is debatable. Up to 20% of these people go on to develop PTSD. An estimated 8% of Americans have PTSD at any given time. Women twice as likely as men. Studies show a definite increase in the incidence and prevalence of mental disorders due to war. WHO estimated 10% of the people who experience a traumatic event, will have serious mental health problems. This can be not only PTSD, but anxiety, somatoform disorder, and depression. Also in Anglo-Saxon literature, we learned about different types of trauma. Type 1 trauma, which is a circumscribed single incident trauma, and type 2 trauma, which is more complex trauma, usually involves relational problems, it involves betrayal and mistrust in primary relations, and complex PTSD, which was described by Judith Herman, the psychological impact of subordination to coercive control that has many common features, whether it occurs in the public sphere of politics or within the private sphere of sexual or domestic relations. So we see how the concept of trauma and PTSD has evolved to get out of the experience of soldiers who usually go to a foreign land, make their fight, and return to the safety of their home. And it included other kinds of trauma, which it belongs to a wider spectrum of people. Also, psychologists have elaborated, maybe in a more progressive way, on the meaning of trauma in comparison to psychiatric definition, the rigid psychiatric definition of trauma. So one good definition of trauma is that it is the disaster of helplessness that was made by Levin. Trauma can be understood as the experience of being made into an object. PTSD symptoms are an inefficient attempt to cope with the helplessness and tell the story of the traumatic event. It's the earthquake within, as it was described. According to Herman, trauma does not only affect the intra-psychic world, but also a person's relationships. Victims of extreme violence often have difficulties relating to others because violence harms the internalized, culturally constituted webs of trust based on social norms, worldviews, and moral conventions. So that was a more progressive and general definition of trauma. Let me focus on the situation in Palestine and our difficulties with the Western definitions of trauma. First, I share with you a geopolitical understanding of the situation in Palestine. We see the old map of historical Palestine where Palestinians used to live. Then the events in 47, 48 have created a dispossessed population of Palestinians. 2/3 of Palestinians became refugees or were dispossessed out of the country, outside the borders of historical Palestine, in exile. And in 67, Palestinians lost more than 80% of the land of historical Palestine. And they lived in geographically separate areas in Gaza and the West Bank. And this land, also the Gaza and the West Bank, became more shattered and fragmented with the ongoing occupation and military control of the land in Palestine. So now actually Palestinians, they live in a land that is completely fragmented, and there is no geographical continuity between their separate areas, which look more like cantons and Bantustans. This is a closer image of Gaza and the West Bank. In Gaza, we have 2 million people living. In the West Bank, 3 million people. Those are called the Palestinian territories. Palestinians who live there are like 1/3 of the overall Palestinian population. There is 1 million of Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, and a vast majority of Palestinians living abroad. But I will be speaking about the living experience of Palestinians in the Palestinian territories mainly. So this is an example of a daily thing that we see in Palestine, in the streets of Palestine, whether we're talking about Jerusalem, the West Bank. The situation is even more difficult in Gaza. This is a routine checkup in Jerusalem at Damascus Gate. This image also shows a very common experience. According to the Palestinian Public Bureau of Statistics, 20% of the Palestinian population experienced military and political imprisonment. Usually it starts in adolescence, and so many Palestinians have a revolving door relationship with the Israeli prison. This is an experience that impacts the identity and the personality of some people. Sometimes it forces them to submission, and sometimes it forces them to a reenactment of their traumatic experience. So it's very easy for them to find themselves again in political detention. And this is another image that comes from Gaza. We can say that there was an earthquake there, with the big difference that an earthquake is not man-made and it is not deliberate. But an image like that is made deliberately to affect you psychologically, to shatter the system of meaning, the value system, the core beliefs of an individual. So it is deliberate, and the impact of it is huge. This is also a common image that we see, that we experience, that we go through. Laborers going at dawn to their work in Israeli settlements. They come out of their Palestinian villages and towns, going through the checkpoints in conditions that are not suitable at all for human beings. So this is an example of extreme stress and traumatic events. I say that as a professional, but also as a person who lives these conditions or who is connected with people who go through these experiences. Now, if you want to match this experience with the official psychiatric definitions that I mentioned from the DSM, we might find them sub-threshold, like they don't meet the description of the definition from the DSM. Nevertheless, we see the profound psychological impact on the people of these events, this lifestyle. So some literature about trauma in Palestine, the Gaza Community Mental Health Center have published a lot. And in one study that was made in 2005, they concluded that only 2.5% of the Palestinians don't have PTSD symptoms. But that questions the methodology that they use. They use actually in this study, the usual Western research tools to make such a conclusion. And Dr. Derek Summerfield criticized forcing the contours of the Palestinian experience into an individualized diagnostic category. Rita Jackaman from Firenze University have identified humiliation as a salient element of injury in Palestine, predicting negative health outcome. Her work was followed by Barber, who demonstrated that over 25 years, persistent humiliation in Palestine was associated with widespread poor outcomes in health, economic, political, and psychological functioning. Historical trauma theory is a framework that matches and is suitable for the Palestinian experience. Elder described that lives are lived in a specific historical times and places. If historical times and places change, they change the way people live in their lives. There are three basic constructs of the theory, which are historical trauma experience, historical trauma response, and the intergenerational transmission of historical trauma. And there are four underpinning assumptions for historical trauma theory. Those are: mass trauma is deliberately and systematically inflicted upon target population by a subjugating dominant population. The second, trauma is not limited to a single catastrophic event, but continues over an extended period of time. This also applies to Palestine. Traumatic event reverberate throughout the population, creating a widespread experience of trauma. Also true about Palestine. The magnitude of the trauma experience derails the population from its natural projected historical course, resulting in a legacy of physical, psychological, social, and economic disparities that persist across generations. All of these apply to Palestine. So we understand trauma as something that goes beyond the harm to individuals. Of course, there is a lot of harm that happens to individuals. Physical injuries, amputations, people shot in their eyes, people who are killed, circles of grief, all of that. But also when these things happen, everyone in the society is touched because they intimidate people, because they force helplessness on people. So the occupation not only attacks the bodies and brains of those who are individually affected, it also attacks the social fabric, the norms, the symbolic representation, and the collective identity of Palestinian society. So while the PTSD symptoms of an individual include re-experiencing hypervigilance and avoidance, the societal consequences of the occupation are internalized oppression, fascination with the occupier, identification with the aggressor, prevalent mistrust throughout the community, low collective confidence and self-esteem, loss of subjectivity and objectification, loss of agency and acceptance of passive victimhood. This is not to say that this is the only syndrome that we see. Some people who are traumatized because of this, these conditions might have these consequences. They might touch certain groups in the society. This is not to ignore other positive responses that my colleague Sabrina will be speaking about. So this situation is very challenging to mental health professionals like myself. I had Western education. I had parts of my education in France, in the UK, and in the Israeli Institute of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy also. But we see something different, something that we were not equipped to deal with. In my Western education, we learned how to do EMDR, trauma-focused CBT, prolonged exposure. All of these different kinds of therapies are suitable for individuals who have primary trauma, less suitable for complex trauma, and of course, they don't have an answer for the collective trauma. The key principles in all these kinds of therapies are related to the safe place, the creation of the safe place and telling the story. And I will be talking about the challenges in these things. I want to say also that it has been claimed that in one study done by Ragid Sharara and colleagues, it has been claimed that among countries in the Eastern Mediterranean region, the country with the greatest burden of morbidity due to mental illness is Palestine. That study was made in 2017, and another one 2019, both of them before COVID time. The WHO study 2019 says that mental illness is a public health issue due to the context of chronic occupation and the exposure to violence. There was another study in conflict zones that, including Palestine, not only restricted to Palestine, but arrived to the conclusion that 22.1 is the point prevalence of mental health disorders in conflict areas. Palestine suffers from fragmentation of services between Gaza and the West Bank. 22 psychiatrists in the West Bank, 10 psychiatrists in Gaza. Very few. There is big shortage in personnel. There is a dominance of a biomedical model that pathologizes individuals and ignores power dynamics and collective aspects of our experience. NGOs also, who try to help in Palestine, they exhibit a misunderstanding of the meaning of neutrality and impartiality when it comes to working under occupation with people who are affected by the occupation. So this is a brief description of the services that we have. Governmental services have community. It's basically a community-based services, community mental health centers. We have 14 in the West Bank, 6 in Gaza. We have 1 psychiatric hospital in the West Bank, a smaller one in Gaza. Services are also integrated in primary health care, in the United Nations Relief and Work Agency services, and in non-governmental organizations and in the private sector. But this is a figure that shows the big shortage in Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank, even when we compare them not to UK or other parts of the world, when we compare them to other countries in the region like Lebanon and Jordan, which are also part of low middle income countries. The shortage is huge. For example, for 100,000 population, we have half a psychiatrist in Gaza and in the West Bank. We have special challenges. As I explained, we have different socio-political contexts. In Jerusalem, and many of the people, I am a Jerusalemite myself, we have the status of residents, but not citizens. And sometimes we are treated by the Israeli system. And when a Palestinian woman, for example, goes to be treated in the Israeli system in the emergency room and seen by a mental health professional in the emergency room, after her home was demolished, she will present with palpitation, shortness of breath, for which no medical reason is found. And usually the diagnosis describes her personality. This comes from an emergency room where the doctor had one contact with the patient, and the diagnosis was emotionally unstable personality and malingering. And it's common if she were a man and she will present shouting and express anger after a traumatic event, it's easy to give him the diagnosis of an antisocial psychopath. The psychiatric hospital that is made for Palestinians, where Palestinians go, it's not made for Palestinians, but where Palestinians and Israelis will go and get treated, is located in a massacre place. A famous massacre that took place in '48 is Deir Yassin massacre, and it is where the psychiatric hospital Kfar Shaul is located. So I'll talk briefly about some dilemmas in my practice. So the problem with the diagnosis of PTSD, trauma is prolonged, enduring, collective. There is no post in Palestine. It is intertwining. People carry not only their individual trauma when their home is demolished or when they are threatened or injured. Also, their father spent a long time in prison and was tortured, and their grandfather comes from a village that was demolished and he became a refugee. So everything is mixed up and intertwining, and people carry symptoms that we often don't know where they come from which level of trauma, from which generation. And people can be very easily forced to helplessness by watching what happens to others, not by having a physical threat or trauma for themselves. Principles of treatment are telling the story and having a safe place. But there is no safe place in Palestine. I work with ex-prisoners who know that they will go to prison again. And often in the middle of my work with them, they will be re-detained again. They don't feel safe. And people don't feel when we live in a country that exports spying software to the world. How can people feel confidence or security to tell their story to the psychiatrist? Sometimes patients who are not paranoid or schizophrenic, ask me to take my mobile and my computer out of the room so that they can tell the story. They don't want to give their true name. They would give a code. So this is an example of the difficulties in working with trauma. Trauma, Western literature does not account for the local idioms of distress. People come often with somatic expression, but they speak often about metaphors. My back is broken, for example, or there is water in my mouth when they cannot tell something. In the minds of many people, they culturally think that it is humiliating to complain to anyone other than God. So we have to bypass all these difficulties in order to pave the way to trauma work in our culture. There are two proverbs in Palestine. I will attempt to translate them. One of them is العين بصيرة والإيد قصيرة, which says, I have insight, but I'm short-handed. I can do nothing about it. I realize what needs to be done, but I cannot do it. I cannot afford doing it because of power relationship or because of lack of resources. Another proverb is قومك إن جنوا عقلك ما بينفعك. If your people lose their mind, what can I do with my brain? What can one do with his brain? So it's the normalcy of sickness and illness and suffering. How to talk sense to power is another important question. How can we support people negotiating with power structure without setting the scene for their termination, for their suicide, for their a big damage, a big risk happening to them? How to get people to talk when there is pervasive mistrust and infiltration. And another dilemma is solidarity and activism, which I perceive as essential roles for a mental health activist working in a colonial context. How can we express them and advocate for them when there is misunderstanding about neutrality and impartiality? I claim that international solidarity is therapeutic. It validates the humanity of Palestinians. Trauma usually happens in loneliness. And when Palestinians are in a political predicament, people feel isolated and lonely. So international solidarity plays an important role in validating the experience. This is what we do in our therapeutic work. We listen to people, we give the impression that they are heard, they are seen, and international solidarity can do that for us. It acknowledges the feelings and the subjectivity of Palestinians, support their aspiration as agents and actors of change. It has the potential to generalize to mutual and global activism for justice. So it allows Palestinians to have to get out of the checkpoints and the isolation and have international exchange with people outside the borders of Palestine. Collective trauma can be alleviated through cohesive and collective efforts such as recognition, remembrance, solidarity, community psychology, and massive cooperation. This is an example of some work that I've been involved in, which relates to professional solidarity. Those are logos of different associations, local and international, of mental health professionals who care about understanding oppression and the subjectivity of people under occupation and try to support them. So in conclusion, there are plenty of examples in Palestine and other places under oppression and colonization where techniques of psychological weaponry were used deliberately to cause confusion in the minds of people and intimidate them into submission and resignation. Post-traumatic illness is not an inevitable consequence of trauma, and not all post-traumatic illness is PTSD. It's a wide spectrum of reactions that can include resilience, sumud, submission, resignation. It's a wide spectrum, and we need to understand it within this context. Our research tools and clinical interventions should be adapted to our special context. And I want to finish with the words of Frantz Fanon when he wrote his resignation letter to the French government. He said, if psychiatry is the medical technique that aims to enable man no longer to be a stranger in his environment, I owe it to myself to affirm that the Arab, the Algerian in that situation, the Palestinian in our situation, is permanently an alien in his own country, lives in a state of absolute depersonalization. And I think mental health professionals should take responsibility in front of that situation. And thank you very much for listening, and I hope I didn't take too much time.
Thank you very much, Samah. This was really, really interesting. So I'm Sabrina Russo. I would like to, first of all, to thanks our colleagues from the APA 52 division that made all of this work beyond the scenes to make this seminar possible, Rosa, Luca, PIna. Also, of course, I'm honored to share this with my friend and colleague Samah. I also would like to say that the majority of my references, they come from a very deep and professional scientific work from my colleagues from Milano Bicocca University, which is, I'm talking about Veronese, Cavazzoni, and Pepe. And I'll start. I'll see if I'm already sharing or I have to share again. Okay. Okay. So the central topic will go more into the particular case of children. And we are still talking about Palestine. And as you could hear from the presentation of Dr. Samah, the situation is giving to children and also adults a lot of traumatic events to deal with. So children who grow up exposed to war and military violence in a context of ongoing structural oppression, like Palestine, are known to be at risk of psychological burden caused by this cumulative exposure to traumatic events, and of course in an unsafe environment. Now, numerous studies have been examined the psychological consequences of and the effects of on children mental health of being exposed to the violence of war and military occupation. The majority of these works offers a quantitative evidence of the association between the exposure to violence and the negative mental health outcome. In our case, I'm posing a question. I'm a researcher, an academic, but I'm mostly a clinician. So I'm in Palestine since 15 years. In around 2013 till 2016, I've been holding some debriefing groups around in villages that they were particularly hit by the occupation, like villages or in Area C. So we were seeing a lot of arrests and night raids and also killing of people. So the idea was psychological debriefing for children, with my big surprise coming from a Western background, like Samah was remembering this. I studied in Italy, I'm Italian. So I also came with my very strong definition of PTSD, ASD, and everything which is related to trauma, with some boxes and a very little flexibility. So with my big surprise, then I didn't see so much PTSD. So what is the question? No, it was observe, not just from me, from many colleagues, that the level of traumatic events in Palestine is very high. The population that reported not significant level of post-traumatic symptoms, at least in the way that we categorize them in the clinical and scientific literature of mental disorders. Maybe this is even the reason why it's very important to make this webinar with the APA, because we have something to say about the DSM and our will to change something in it. So the question is, why? The expectation and the literature that we already know will lead us to think that there should be a very high level of post-traumatic stress disorder. But this is not the case. So the narrative that I want to propose is about positive outcome in general. Certainly there are, and obviously there are some protective factors that make Palestinians resilient. We have a smaller body of studies about associating the exposure to adverse events with positive outcome. For example, positive coping styles, personal growth, life satisfaction, self-competence. More recently, research began to focus on functioning, the protective factors that they might enable children to conserve their psychological well-being in the face of an ongoing traumatic event. When we are talking about ongoing, it means that it's not the event. Dr. Samah was very clear about this. So the event, the traumatic event is something, but if your lifestyle, it's events, traumatic events, then you eventually develop some way to cope. In this part of literature, the perspective see children as competent, as socially situated actors, not victims. Actors who are capable to mobilize resources of agency to protect themselves from the negative consequence of war and violence. Resilience, so we have been already mentioning. When we talk about resilience, we need to adopt a socio-ecological point of view. There are many factors that can protect children from trauma and foster their resilience. What we have been noticing internationally, and not just in Palestine, is that to maintain a kind of sense of satisfaction with their life, children, they could also protect their mental health, providing them with resources for survival, even where general life conditions were compromised. Yet, these studies do not really explain what means life satisfaction, or how life satisfaction can mitigate somehow these trauma symptoms and fostering the psychological functioning or supporting psychological functioning. One possibility is that human agency plays a role in sustaining life satisfaction in children which grows up in this adverse living condition. Now, here we make some hypotheses. And the hypothesis is, there's a question, does children's ability to mobilize positive resources improve their life satisfaction, and in so doing, mitigate their traumatic response? So we start researching agency And the hypothesis is that a strong sense of agency would enhance life satisfaction. And secondarily, that life satisfaction would be associated with the fewer traumatic symptoms. The concept of agency, I will mention what agency is and what we mean with life satisfaction. So Bandura is the main reference for agency. He operationalized the construct of human agency as individual personal resources, such as self-confidence and self-efficacy. Self-confidence is how much you trust yourself, and self-efficacy, in a very small definition, of course, is your power, how much you believe that you can change your life, how much you believe that you are not a victim and you are not passive, but you're active. So according to Bandura, and here we use even some of his words, self-efficacy beliefs are especially crucial for inner motivation, to move, to change, to resist. Among the mechanism of agency, none is more central or pervasive than people's belief in their efficacy, to manage their functioning, to exercise control over events that affect their life. If we go to life satisfaction, we have Hübner as main reference. He conceptualized life satisfaction in children as a multifaceted individual cognitive state, which is concerning several domains, such as family, school, living environments, peer relationship, personal satisfaction, and all these together contributes to personal well-being and the quality of life. In the Palestinian context, again, life satisfaction and positive affects balance have been identified as factors that can help to mitigate the stress symptoms. So maybe here is the beginning of the answer, or the key to understand. Here, presenting in a very summarized way, to my opinion, a very interesting research is agency via life satisfaction as protective factor from cumulative trauma and emotional distress among Bedouin children in Palestine. The research authors are Veronese, Pepe Cavazzoni, Obaid, and Perez, 2019. So again, adopting this ecological perspective on children's functioning, it's been the authors investigate the association between agency and life satisfaction. So in which way is healing these trauma symptoms or negative emotions in a specific population, which is a group of Bedouin children living in the occupied Palestinian territories. Bedouin communities in Palestine, they are living and moving into some lands. They have been in these lands since a very long time. We are talking about centuries. They consider it their land, and they believe they have the right to stay and move in these lands. The most of this community are due to eviction, which it means that the Israeli state is trying to bring them from some land to other places. We should expect that these children, which are facing many times in different ways soldiers and a very militarized environment, they might be deeply affected by the situation or the environment. Although the authors in this research, they hypothesize that these children, if more agentic, with a higher agency, more they could be satisfied from their life. So with the study focused on these two levels, and there was then an equation of modeling that was performed to evaluate how direct it was, or indirect, the effects between agency, life satisfaction, and trauma. The findings confirm that the key role of life satisfaction in mitigating the trauma reaction was there. The new finding was that the role of agency in enhancing life satisfaction was contributing to mitigate trauma-related symptoms. Of course, what made life satisfaction a possibility, it was social relationship, school, living environment, that they were perceived by children as sufficient, protective, and safe. Sufficient. Now, for children in these situations, possessing agency means having a sense of control, the power over their own life, self-perceived expressed capability to act, to transform internal and external dynamics, causing psychological distress and unwellness associated with the ongoing violence. Now, I would like to enter in a sub-concept of agency, which is very important here. It's the spatial agency, the agency related to the place. Maybe the sentence that you will hear more from Palestinians, children and non, is that this is my land, and I'm not gonna leave my land. And when we talk about space and places, this is something that is defining our identity. It is not a physical place just. It is a physical place, and it is the place in which we build our values and beliefs. So place as a meaningful space provides, or withholds, a variety of emotional, psychological, and material elements. Place is not only a sense of protection and reassurance, but is instrumental in providing a view for creativity, exploration, social interactions, which are all factors that they are especially important for children development. Through spaces, we build the identity again. So land, homes, and location link the past with the present and to the future. Now, the truly benefit from a place must be sovereignty and the freedom within it, something that we miss in Palestine. So these entanglements of place with power opens multiple possibilities for place to be imbued with abuse and trauma. So indeed, while discussing the psychological context of Palestine, we do well by remembering that the role of a place within settler colonial violence, which uses dispossession and displacement as its key strategy in attempts to repress, dominate, scatter, and often decimate population. I'll give you here a definition. We call it Palestine, but internationally it is called occupied Palestinian territory. The International Court of Justice referred to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as the occupied Palestinian territory. And this term was used by legal definition by the International Court of Justice in the ruling of July 2004. Also, United Nations, with all of their agency, have been using the same terminology: occupied Palestinian territory. European Union and European Commission also adopt occupied Palestinian territory. Now, what they mean, they refer to the area controlled by the Palestinian National Authority and occupied by the State of Israel. Going back to spatial agency, which is the topic, there is another research. Authors are Veronesa Susi Cavazzoni-Schumann, 2020. Spatial agency as a source of resistance and resilience among Palestinian children living in Deishe refugee camp. A refugee camp, it's a camp, and refugees are people which were living in the now State of Israel. In 1948, they were more than thousands of Palestinians were forcibly removed from their lands and their houses, and they found the refugee in the West Bank. So then we have refugee camps from that time. The actual research very much shows and draws the attention to how within the oppressive colonial and local politics underpin Palestinians, social suffering, spatial strategies of resistance and resilience are key to promote the psychological functioning and well-being. The work of the authors, it's situated into the concept of spatial agency and broader to the agency, and contributes to increase asserting how children's ongoing engagement and attachment to place represent a set of opportunity to enhance their psychological well-being, sense of coherence, competence, self-determination. Which in other words, it means that if I feel that I can re-own my place, I'll be more resistant to psychological effects of trauma, negative psychological effects of trauma. So in brief, the study illustrates that children continued in Deishe to use and enjoyment of the places and represent an embodied form of everyday resistance, which brings it a sense of freedom, normalcy, and peace. Their use and making of places help children to define themselves, their lives, thereby resisting the sole identification of themselves as suffering, weak, and traumatized. So the same concept again, from victims to actors. In conclusion, the concept of agency might be expected to shed light on how children boost their life satisfaction, protecting themselves from traumatic stress when exposed to military violence and political oppression. And I do believe that this is the case of Palestinians and Palestinian children. The human capability to act has been studied under the umbrella of agency in this seminar, and the construct is prompt to revisiting the mainstream framing of children exposed to violence as defenseless victims, and shift towards a new conceptualization of young people as active and empowered subjects. And thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much both to Samah and Sabrina for your insightful and bottom-up perspective into today's webinar main topic. And as you may have noticed, number of comments, thanking comments, appreciating ones are already in the chat. And I just saw that Samah has already typed some questions, some replies to them. So by the way, all kinds of requests for information about the material that our speakers have used for preparing the webinar, and even the registration itself will be easily found on following the Division 52 of the APA website and YouTube channel. So by the way, there are also some very intriguing questions, conceptual, methodological questions. But let me just start this Q&A sessions with the speakers by some let's say some inspiring thoughts that came out through your presentation. And I'd like just to share very briefly something to both of you, and any of you may come up with an answer, a further let's say troubling question yourself. I found that a kind of 3 words have been the most, let's say, common between both of your presentation, and also very crucial. And they are, for sure, trauma. They are the PTSD definition of trauma and place. I was kind of fascinated by Samah's discussion over the controversy, the scientific controversy about the notion of PTSD, which has kind of changed from the former notion of military experience in an exotic context towards a more domestic violence concept. And I found quite interesting the way she applied this kind of controversy to the lack of the percentage, the rate of people formerly suffering from PTSD in Palestine. And actually this kind of concept, so this shift from an exotic experience to an experience that is possible to feel in your familiar environment, has kind of shaped my underlining assumption about what you said, the intertwining components of this collective trauma. So when you said one of my dilemmas, one of your dilemmas in your practice, in your psychiatric practice, is which generation does this trauma come from? And I found this question very interesting, because a number of times, as it emerged from your presentation, looks like that the traumatic experience is a threat, not a direct experience itself. And this is how kind of the trauma persists and the trauma shapes a society itself. So I wanted to just share this comment, and maybe a little bit from your experience about this domestic and exotic idea of trauma that come to be intertwined in Palestine. And then we can go on with other stimulating questions in the chat. Any of you may just have a reply, so Sabrina or Samah, or we can...
Yeah, I was thinking maybe Samah can answer this. What do you think?
Which one? Which question?
The question about this, from where it comes, the trauma in all of this intergenerational.
I understood it as a comment. Yeah, I understood it as a comment. Because I stated in my presentation, I see trauma as radioactive here in Palestine. When someone is traumatized, like very often in my clinical work, I see people who carry PTSD, trauma-related symptoms, not necessarily PTSD, because of a trauma that happened to another person, a family member. In our work, sometimes we know vicarious trauma, but in families, it's really difficult to dissect the roots of that trauma and to know where it comes from. I think it is so pervasive and intertwining, and it has the capacity to be radioactive and pass from one person to another.
Thanks a lot, Samah. So we can go on. I will pick up some questions, hope to cover at least some of them. Okay, so there's one very interesting question to Samah. Okay, so amazing work, and we are very proud of you. I have two questions. What is the hardest part for you as a psychiatrist working in the occupied Palestinian territory? Also, another question, you have talked about psychological impact on people, but what about the impact on psychiatrists themselves, who are overwhelmed and in shortage to provide help for people? How do you cope as psychologists and psychiatrists in the occupied Palestinian territory?
I attempted to, maybe I answered this question in writing, but I will say briefly, let me take the second part of the question. Psychiatrists and other mental health workers are Palestinian individuals, and also there is a special psychological impact that comes from their work, and they need, many of them are trained to take care of themselves. And as someone who is also responsible for constructing services for mental health professionals in Palestine, we take into consideration helping the helpers. So yes, we acknowledge the trauma and suffering among mental health professionals. For example, one of my colleagues in Gaza, he had many family members, he lost many family members due to bombardment as a Palestinian person. But he's also all the time in the work of listening to other traumatized people. So it is very important for mental health professionals to take care of themselves, and for mental health organizations to include helping the helpers and provide supervision and support for health professionals. As for the most difficult experience for me in Palestine, I think it's dealing with the internalized oppression and the fascination with the aggressor when it is experienced in my communication with other Palestinians. I can identify the illness, but I don't have solutions. I have some ideas. In my mind, I'm all the time busy in finding a therapy, a remedy for this, for me, most horrible experience of life under occupation. When I encounter Palestinians who are fascinated with Israelis and who identify with the aggressor and who take a similar role like that of the Israelis with their own people. Unfortunately, this exists in Palestine, and we encounter it, and our Western training in dealing with trauma has not prepared us for ready solutions to fix this, this impact.
Thank you so much. I don't know if I have still 1 minute just to read another question, then I guess we're done. Okay, so as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, media in Europe regularly report about the mental state of distress of children and adolescents. It seems that the resilience level in Europe and also in the US is rather low. Could one assume the life satisfaction is much lower as compared with the Palestinian society, where greater sense of identity, meaning, belonging, social cohesion are potentially supporting factors? Maybe this one could be answered by Sabrina.
I would answer in this way. COVID-19 affect all of us. Even we also had it in Palestine. We don't miss anything. So in that period, me and my colleague Hanin Ayub, we undertake a research and we made some interviews to children of different ages. What it comes out that might help to answer this question is that we found in common with other children in other countries, a lot of worries and the isolation, no schools, and all of this. But there was maybe a difference, is that in Palestine, we had other lockdowns before. The situation of being a bit unsafe all the time, it is normalized, and when it's normalized, it has a bad impact, but also a positive one. So we go back to the idea of this, positive outcome that make people to raise up their coping mechanism. So I've been myself, as Italian living in Palestine, hearing from relatives and friends, Sabrina, is like a war, is like a war, is like a war. Well, no, it's not like a war. It is terrible what happened with the COVID-19, but it's not like a war.
So the time is over. I just want to thank the speakers and also Stella for moderating, and especially thank you all for participating in this webinar. We would love to hear from you in the audience about this webinar, so please provide feedback on your experience about both the content and the format of today's discussion. And on behalf of the Division 52 webinar committee, I just want to wish you to enjoy the rest of your day and the upcoming weekend, and stay tuned on the next events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.